All right, stories are surfacing that special counsel Robert Mueller's team is preparing its final report, and now a new face is in charge of the Justice Department after Attorney General Jeff Sessions' resignation at the request of the president. So let's look at what we know about the acting Attorney General, Matthew Whitaker. All right, from 2004 to 2009, he served as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Iowa, later becoming a managing partner at an Iowa law firm before joining the administration in 2014. He unsuccessfully ran to be the junior senator from Iowa on a very conservative platform. Whitaker has been outspoken about his feelings on the Mueller investigation. In an op-ed that was written for The Hill, he defended the president's firing of former FBI Director James Comey, and in another one written for CNN, he argued that Mueller looking at the president's business or finances, quote, raises serious concern that the special counsel's investigation was a mere witch hunt. On CNN, he suggested that a new attorney general, ironically now him, could simply starve Mueller's investigation of funds rather than actually fire him. In that interview and elsewhere, Whitaker has said that Robert Mueller is highly respected and likely doesn't pay attention to news swirling around the Justice Department. But Whitaker has also tweeted about the investigation, linking to his own writing and other articles commenting things like worth a read about the president's ability to fire the special counsel and characterizing the investigation as a fishing expedition. According to the New York Times, he was recommended by Leonard Leo, who's the head of the Federalist Society. That's the same group that provided approved lists of Supreme Court choices to the president. And Whitaker was involved in an so-called invention marketing company based in Miami that the Federal Trade Commission has labeled a scam. Stephanie.
The story. Joining us now, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Elliot Williams. Okay, Elliot, help us out here. This guy has a very, very public view on the Mueller probe.
And
he has spoken about it. He's written about it. Wouldn't that require him to recuse himself?
I mean, he's already made opinions about this thing he's got to oversee.
Right, well, it certainly requires him to seek the advice of the ethics officials at the Justice Department.
Okay,
and yeah, it smells really bad, and it looks really bad. Yeah, okay.
Seek the advice of the lawyers at the ethics department. Spare me, this is 2018 in the Trump administration.
Sure,
Does that actually have any teeth to it?
I got it. Well, I mean, those are career officials. Now, the question is, the rules seem not to apply to Trump and Trump senior officials. And so, again, nothing mandates recusal in most instances. The question is, does this look bad? Does it smell bad? And does it give the appearance of impropriety? And of course, across all of these things you've identified. Now, certainly, look, there's nothing wrong with being a member of the Federalist Society. There's nothing wrong with having been part of this company that's been shut down by the Federal Trade Commission. What's at issue is these clearly expressed views on shutting down an investigation, clearly expressed views on how it should be funded and conducted. So there's all kinds of conflicts of interest that most, frankly, any reasonable attorney would ultimately seek recusal for. So yeah, he should seek he will seek, and I believe they're doing the ethics review now. But I guess he said, as you saw some reporting this morning, that he's committed or has no intention of recusing, which is preposterous.
So if I were named acting anything, I would wait to see what happens before rearranging all the furniture. When it comes to the Mueller investigation, as acting Attorney General, does he have the same authority as a fully confirmed Attorney General?
He does. Attorney General is one of those positions where some of those nuances with respect to nominating people into vacancies as acting don't really apply. And so, yes, he can carry things out. Now, if Rod Rosenstein is to stay on, how does that affect the conduct of the Mueller probe? And potentially he could manage the Mueller probe through Rod Rosenstein or whatever. The simple fact is, regardless of these behind-the-scenes HR decisions, we know that this individual was put in place because of his views on the Mueller probe and because of his views on sort of the primacy of Donald Trump and so on, because he's an insider and someone who's going to be loyal to the president. What got Jeff Sessions in trouble in the first place was the fact that he wasn't sufficiently loyal to the president, which is tremendously ironic given that no individual has been more loyal to the president's agenda than Jeff Sessions, if you look at everything, from immigration and to criminal justice reform and on all of these issues. So this was all about loyalty, and it's all about the fact that the president expects the Justice Department to be his lawyers, to be his stooges to some extent, and that's what I think we're starting to see here.
Well,
it's a shame.
We know that the president expects that. The question will be, Ali, what does the rest of the government think? Will we see Congress take action to protect Robert Mueller? Elliot, thank you so much. We appreciate it today.
Thanks a lot.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.